Welcome to our June 360 presentation. I'm Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and today I'm happy to introduce artist Joseph Havel. Joseph Havel's sculptures transform the domestic and mundane into the poetic and timeless. In Havel's hands, everyday items that most of us rarely give a second thought, white dress shirts, curtains, tablecloths, clothing labels, become a medium to address complex biological, historical, economical, and sociological issues in art. A Minneapolis native, Havel moved to Houston in 1991 to join the staff of the Glassell School of Art, where he has served as director since 1996. He has exhibited his art across the United States and abroad, including solo shows in Dallas, St. Louis, Barcelona, and Paris. Havel was selected to participate in the 2000 Whitney Biennial and the 2001 Phoenix Triennial, and in 2006, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston hosted the exhibition Joseph Havel, A Decade of Sculpture, and published an accompanying catalog. He has received numerous awards, including a National Endowment for the Arts Artist Fellowship, a Tiffany Fellowship, and a Purchase Award from the French Ministry of Culture. Havel's work is held in the collections of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Dallas Museum of Art, and the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, among others. He is represented in Dallas by Tally Dunn Gallery. We're so pleased to have him with us here today. Please join me now in welcoming Joseph Havel.
I was talking to a couple people here. My first time to Texas was in 1979. I moved to Texas right out of graduate school. And I didn't move to Houston. I moved to Dallas. I actually moved to Sherman, Texas, to teach at Austin College. So this lecture for me is a little bit different than any other lectures. I don't think I've spoken at the Fort Worth Modern, but I haven't given a lecture in Dallas probably since I lectured at SMU about 20 years ago. So when I was thinking about this, I really much more, usually because of my variety of roles, I'm an artist, but I also run this residency program. And so I lecture quite a bit, not, art schools and so forth. I usually use them to talk a little bit more about some kind of contemporary issue that I think is prevalent, that I think my work addresses in one way, but is kind of a critical issue. But this is much more autobiographical, and in fact, I'm showing some really early images. In 1979, on August 20th, I drove into Sherman, Texas, to start teaching at Austin College. And I remember very well that as I was driving in from Oklahoma, on the side of the road, there was it was 104 degrees, and there was a burning pickup truck. And I thought, oh, well, I had been in Pennsylvania. I had just rented a place in Long Island City, thinking I was moving to Long Island City in New York. And then I got this teaching position at Austin College. So I got here. I have to say that Dallas, this was, like I said, an odd lecture for me to prepare for because Dallas was critical or important to me in a number of ways. It's the first place I had a solo exhibition at a nonprofit, which was the artist-run Space 500X Gallery. It was the first commercial gallery show that I ever had, which was at a gallery called DW Gallery. It was at it's where I sold my first sculpture to Tim and Nancy Hanley. It's where I did my first large bronze with the Barretts. And it's where I sold my first piece to a museum, which was at the Dallas Museum. The U.S. Trust Company started this purchasing. At that time, they were purchasing works for the Dallas Museum, and mine was the first work that they purchased of a Texas artist for the Dallas Museum. So I had all this record, and it was, in fact, the first place I realized what it meant when something went into a museum, because the sculpture was in two parts, and they put it together wrong. And I walked into the museum, and I saw the sculpture sitting there, and I could have reached up and moved it, and it would have been right. And I went, I can't touch it any longer. And so it's when I realized that once it's in a museum, you can't touch it. So this is sort of an interesting. So here I am. I'm going to show some very early works, and then we'll kind of go through them quickly, and I'll explain little bits of them, but I'm open to questions afterwards. So thank you all for coming. What a great group for Saturday. This was my second show at 500X Gallery. I never show these images. I did my graduate work in painting and drawing and in ceramics. And so these pieces are large ceramic sculptures. And it's almost the last body of work I did in ceramics. These, I really don't have much to say about them. It was nice to see them. I hadn't really looked at them for, until I scanned this slide recently, for decades. Oh, by the way, I have to apologize. Some of the images are going to be cut off because we have a little problem with the projector today. So, you know, I'm apologizing in advance. So I have to remind you as we go through if you see the tops or bottoms cut off of things. For me, Dallas, coming out of graduate school, I went to, in a protected environment. To me, Dallas was, at that moment, was a very interesting transition or an exciting scene. There was a lot of, you know, I mean, Deep Ellum, there was a lot of activity that was very interesting for me. So I spent, even though I lived in Sherman, I probably drove into Dallas every evening in order to, or probably 5 out of the 6, 7 evenings of the night. That was sort of my colleagues were all in Dallas. So moving along. From there, one of the things that I started to become interested in was working more with found objects. Again, this is a really early piece. This probably is 1983 or 84. It's a bowling ball. You know, the parts are evident. Having grown up in Minnesota, I certainly know what a sled looks like. And one of the things I liked is that in Sherman, people, and there was something called Heavy Trash Day, and so I could drive around and essentially pick up my sculptures. And all of the people who moved from the north, like I did, who no longer had any snow, there's a couple of sculptures of mine from that time that are both sleds or toboggans, because they would leave them out at heavy. They'd probably keep them wishfully for about 5 years and then leave them out for Heavy Trash Day. That's a little jingle bell on the top, which I actually brought with me from my childhood. So it's sort of, the idea was that it would maybe, that it would maybe be a kind of, that you would imagine the sound of it. And a lot of my work has either figure implications or the invisible figure. And in a way, the placement of this is sort of the sound, the missing sound is sort of the mind component. The Barretts will recognize one of these pieces, which is this front piece was the first large bronze that I ended up making, which is in their yard now. But this was a show that I did not here, but in Houston. This is actually the show that caused me to move from Dallas to Houston. In essence, I got offered a position at the Glassell School to run the core program after I had this show. So twisting chair pieces. People really don't associate this with my work now. It's interesting, though. A few years ago, there was a show at the New Museum in New York. It was a young Los Angeles sculptors, and there's one who was working at the time with twisting, flowing chairs. And somebody emailed me who remembered these pieces because this was sort of the body of work that I did for a number of years. And it was interesting to see it without, you know, things come and go. And without, I'm sure, any knowledge of my pieces, the artist was doing these kind of swinging, flying chair piles, and made reference to my pieces from about 20 years ago without knowing it. This is the piece that the Dallas Museum owns. The first piece I sold. It came apart in 2 sections, and it was just put together incorrectly. It was hilarious, though. I really wanted to touch it, because it would have been so easy to fix. Like I said, I don't want to go too long in this early work. This is still in the early to mid-'80s, maybe going into the later '80s now. This is still when I was living in Sherman, Texas. But a mixed media, a bowling ball, a lantern. A lot of these shapes then began to become, I became interested in different biological references, and particularly I was looking at a lot of books about viruses and virology, and so a lot of them at the time were actually using images from some of those microscopic views of viruses. There's another bronze from that period. I always thought it was, it's only about, maybe about 5 years ago, I actually allowed myself to call myself a sculptor. I never really thought of myself as a sculptor. And I'm going to show you almost all sculpture today, just a couple of drawings. I work equally in drawings, and I work at across materials with the conceptual framework that binds everything together, so that I'm not, and I took almost no sculpture classes because it was all filled with people who were grinding a lot of metal and missing fingers and stuff. And I thought that it was much more, and it was like, how heavy is your work of art? And I thought, this is just not my thing. So I decided I would, instead, I was better in a framework that was more conceptual. In my school, was primarily in the drawing and painting section. And then the ceramics was just because the smartest teacher was in ceramics. So, but so you'll see pieces and you'll see them often. I think of them as images. I've only kind of recently gone, okay, people call me a sculptor, I'm a sculptor. I just wanted to acknowledge that there's probably with each one of these bodies of work, there's a coexisting body of drawings, usually done after the sculptures, not before them, or a body of more ephemeral things that balance the bronzes. So a lot of my work has to do with this. At this time, I was thinking a lot about this phrase in a book that has been very influential to me, a book of poems by a writer by the name of John Berryman. I was thinking a lot about the fact that nothing was still, and that the phrase was all nouns become verbs, which was sort of this breakdown moment in a poem where the author was recognizing that nothing was fixed and that every meaning was in motion and every noun was really a verb. So a lot of my work at this time was addressing, and still, now I don't think about it, but still fundamentally addresses this idea of slippage and transition and change, and found object turned into something else, something in the middle of an action, something happening, some meaning it's gone from sort of more literal to now some meaning that slips from one place to another, where you can get more than one specific meaning from something so that everything's contextual. So anyway, that sort of is a given. This piece is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Okay, so this is kind of from the same period of time. Still living in, the last piece was the first piece I did when I moved to Houston. So this is actually one of the last pieces I did when I had a studio in Sherman, Texas, when I was in the Dallas area. When I got to, one of the things that I recognized, when I was in high school, I made work that in many ways is more conceptual than the work that I made all through college. And a lot of it was around this idea of the white shirt, and I made a film about white shirts, and I made objects related to white shirts, and I made all of these works that were sort of, one of my fundamental things was white shirts. And I quit that body of work a long time ago, but when I moved to Houston and I became the associate director of a museum, I bought my first white shirt, or of the art school, of the art school, because I had to wear it once in a while to board meetings. And so I thought that it was a moment when, and my parents, who never wished for me to go into art, they really wished for me not to go into art actively. And I remember when I was I won an award in school and in art, and my father came to the award ceremony and told everybody that when I got my job in corporate America, I'd have something to do in my spare time. And so, I guess when I got the white shirt, I thought it was a kind of coming home. And I was thinking about a lot of the earlier sculptures were wrapped in a kind of romance, and with a much stronger narrative, and they were often made to be black in one way or another. And I decided that the whiteness, I started to research white as an issue and a topic and so forth, and where the white shirt came from, and where white walls in museums came from, and Le Corbusier, and the whole idea of modernism. And so I decided that there must be some way in which I could begin to examine this issue of my whiteness, and of the authority of whiteness, and of why I had to buy the white shirt to begin with. And so this is one of my early white shirt pieces, which still involved these lampshade pieces. The other reason that this came about, and then I'll buzz on a little bit, is that I started to do these lampshade pieces because people started, this is either career suicides or the move away from constant signatures. It's part of my work. As soon as everybody began to expect that I should make something with a chair in it, I knew I would make no more pieces with chairs in it, because it just somehow killed me if it was like, oh, you're the chair guy. So I began to work with the lampshades because I thought that they were resonant, and they fit some of the things that viruses that I was interested in because they're natural design based. And then from there, I began to work with the other fabric images. And I liked the fact that they were more malleable. This is a piece called Virus. It's, I don't know, maybe it's 365 white shirts sewed onto a ball of lampshades. It's probably about 25 feet tall. And, at this time, too, I was acutely aware for a couple of friends of mine had HIV, and so I was very aware of sort of the human side of disease and so forth, but I also wanted to deal with the malleability of the fabric as a form and yet keep the form solid in some way. And again, I went back to saying figurative. Let's go back. If you look at that piece, it stands a lot like a figure. This is my collar from the first white shirt that I bought. And in about 1993, the white shirt started the idea of putting this collar in all of my shows or a collar piece in all of my shows between 1993 and 1996, wherever I did a solo exhibition, so that I would always be present in one way or another in the show. And it wasn't always my collar. In one case, it was the collar of the curator, Peter Doroshenko, who's here now, curated an exhibition at the Huntington Beach Arts Center that I put his collar in. I put other collars in. So the collar was a way. And the other thing that was important about the collar is that it almost was invisible, but you could always see the shadow. And so the idea of it actually being more real in the shadow than in the collar itself. And these were always hung at essentially my height. So then this piece is called Spine. Same period of time. It was sort of the drill core of collars. It's like every collar. What somebody in fashion told me was that the length of the points on the collar, so it's the equivalent of your lapels, will tell you and the thickness of your collar will tell you the year of your collar, and the quality of the material will tell you the class of the person who's wearing it. So I thought this was an interesting way to kind of create layers of lots of identities into a single identity. Then, being a classic modernist at heart, I decided that I needed to do some pieces that would mine sort of the vocabulary of whiteness in relation to the language of modernism, and sort of the breakdown of modernism back into narrative. The issue of modernism's removal from narrative being really artificial anyway. So here's, and these pieces were this piece was from a group of them where I chose, so that the number wouldn't be arbitrary, I would choose a month, and then I would make a collar piece out of the amount of days in that month, so that until I had 12 different, they were counting pieces. Okay, so you got all these shirts, and suddenly you realize that the labels are really interesting in them. And you're cutting all the labels out because you want them to be completely white. And what I realized is that all of the information that sort of the genetic material of the shirt was in the label. You knew what it was made for, how much it was made for, and so forth. So I liked the fact that it was loaded with information, and then I could pretend I could just pretend it was paint. Okay, so these were often very formally put together, and the same idea of being modernist, but being something that broke down into incident, into story, without me really controlling it. As if I couldn't control the story, it would break down into story anyway. This is my show at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. This is a pair of bronzes to the left. One was once in a collection in Dallas, but was resold to the Gap collection in San Francisco. And there's a laundered shirt and an unlaundered shirt pair. Actually, a lot of my work also will quote historical precedents. And the one in the back is the Sistine Chapel ceiling turned on its side, as done in two white, where Adam and God touch, and done as two white shirts. You probably all know this piece if you go to Fort Worth. I feel very fortunate to have it there in the modern. This was also the piece that was in the Whitney Biennial. This point, I was living in Houston, and I still worked in a very small space in my garage, and this was as tall as I could make the piece at the time. And I remember Michael Opping came, and it was in fabric. It was this is a curtain. This is a curtain from a silk curtain from a movie theater that was down the block from me that closed, that turned into something else now, and so I had it hanging, and Michael Opping came in and looked at it and said, "Is that going to be bronze?" And I said, "Well, I think yeah." And he said, "Well, can we put it in the Whitney Biennial?" So that was how it ended up in the Whitney Biennial, actually. The career suicides or whatever. At this point, I decided that the shirts were getting a good deal of some critical attention, but they were beginning to be written about very, very politically and very singularly about, disenfranchised whiteness and white maleness and so forth. Which is funny because they've been written about it a little bit recently again, and they've sort of lost that aura of. So I decided that I didn't like the load they were carrying. I wanted it to be a little bit more. I wanted the more slippage, and so that's when I went to something that would be a domestic fabric, but would be less laden with an obvious politic, and might also be less laden with gender issues. I wanted this to be able to be both male and female. This is another piece. This is actually in a Dallas collection, too. This is actually an IKEA duvet cover that was cast in bronze. I ripped the IKEA duvet cover apart, and that one little string that you can barely see there was the seam, and it wouldn't tear. Okay, it just tore along the seam, and it left that little thing, and so I just kind of hung it up, and it became this wonderful sort of classical figure that I could then manipulate without without us knowing its specific form. All of these pieces are usually named exactly what they are, like IKEA duvet cover. And because what I want is, I want you to look at them and not know what they are, and then look at the name and face the literalness of it. This is a big curtain. This is my new studio in Houston, or new at that time. This is a bedsheet, king-size bedsheet. I always thought this was like a feminized Richard Serra, It kind of stood there. This is actually one of my favorite bronzes I've ever made. It looked like it was just hanging laundry, and it barely, for some reason, it looks like it barely stands, and yet you have to walk around it, and it has great physical presence. This is cut off at the bottom. When I did the show at the MFAH, kind of extending this whole interest in sort of the domestic and also the meaning of kind of modernist architecture. I was really honored to be in a Mies van der Rohe space. But most people don't know that Mies van der Rohe, in his early work in Germany, the whole drape idea, which is assigned to him, actually came from a woman by the name of Lily Reich, who was also an architect, who did not come to this country, who did a lot of drapery works within Mies spaces or by herself, in which they would divide up spaces. She was often an exhibition designer. And it's, we all know Mies, and there's many, many books. There's one tiny little book on Lily Reich. So I decided that I would sort of make her present, so I'd take the Mies drapes and I would make them come out and be an object as well. So I had them make an extension on the Mies drapes for the show. So that what it would be is that continuous space would then become physical. It also fits in with my idea. A lot of earlier pieces, along with the collars on the white walls as you came in, a lot of those shows at that time would also have what's called a seam, which would be some kind of thing that went from floor to ceiling that would make you understand that the white box that you were in was the same kind of convention as a white shirt, and that it was not a neutral space. White is not a neutral color. It's, in white, it carries a certain kind of authority, and when we enter a gallery space or a museum space, we're in a contract with that authority, and it tells us how to look at things, even though we say it's neutral. And so I wanted to acknowledge that or use that in some way. And I was asked when the museum in Houston built a new building if I would do something for the new building, and I came back to that idea of presentation and so forth. And so I made curtains for the building. They sort of had one of the things was my mother-in-law was always, whenever she moved to Texas right around then, first thing she needed to do was make curtains for all the windows in her house, because that made it her house. And so it kind of combined that with the idea of theater and the fact that there was a contract. Once you enter into a building, if you're shocked or not shocked, you've kind of made a contract. It's a bit of theater inside of every museum. And so I made this piece for the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. These pieces were originally shown with Tally, but this is where they were in the Museum of Fine Art, the show at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and both of these are actually in two different Dallas collections. I saw one of them this morning. Okay. Just because when you're showing images, sometimes there's an implied linearity, like I did this and but I just group things together. So, and what's happened is when I was younger, this idea of one thing preceding another, and this kind of evolution of an idea had one kind of meaning and was more linear. Nowadays, I don't think that way at all. I kind of work on one idea, and then I realize the kind of interchange of all of these ideas so that the physical presence of the objects are not so linear. So this is going to seem linear, but this is back to 1993. This is the first set of labels I cut out of shirts, which are the size images, but I want to use this to introduce this whole idea of the label. When I said I was calling those things almost always very literally what they were, like IKEA duvet cover, that the word, that was about the idea of what you see visually and then what you read and the text of it, about the text being important, actually the image carrying a text with it. When I started to deal with the labels in a way that reversed it, I pretended there was no text and I started to deal with image, so that, but I knew that you could read them and they were legible. Well, this became an idea. I was in the show in New York called Shopping. It was at Deitch Projects. And I made my first label where I actually had a manufacturer who also is in Dallas, who began to make labels from me from words that I would select from this book that I'd used in my work a great deal, this Berryman book that I spoke about, the Dream Songs. And so this precedes that, but that gives you an introduction into why I'm using all of these labels. And what it does is I would photocopy one word out of the book that, to me, by being removed from the book, begin to have multiple implications, change, shift around, be able to flip its meaning. And so in a weird way, by having a piece that had a word on it, it was more abstract than having the concrete things that you literally knew what they were. If that makes sense, it was an inversion in a strange way. I'm saying this because some people say, gee, how do I get with the label pieces, and are they completely different? Well, they're different, but by being so different, they're exactly the same in a strange way. They just come at the same question from a different side. Okay. So this is a label piece. It's a wall about 40 feet long, and I think it's 15 feet tall. This was at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston show that was done before that. It's directly pinned to the wall. And some of you who saw my show at Tally's, there was a recent label piece which shows that we come back to ideas when they suit us better. This is the lost label. One of the things that happens with these label pieces when they have a slight bit of color to them is that if you notice the wall glows purple, because the way they're woven, they're double woven taffeta men's dress shirt labels, and they glow in that space, and so they create a vibration. And even the white one at Tally's did a vibration. I also, in the case of some of the labels, manifest themselves in multiple manners. Some of them only manifest themselves in one way. But this is a perfect grid of labels sewn together. Is 17. The label would form a piece would form a square, 17 feet by 17 feet, and then it's hung from one corner, so that maybe it's about 22 feet tall or something like this. One of the reasons for this, I started to show a great deal in Paris, and one of the things that I wanted to be able to do is I wanted to be able to pack a show in a suitcase. And it's not that I had to, it wasn't because they wouldn't ship it. They would ship it, but I wanted to have that idea that I was mobile as an artist, and that if I walked into a space, that I could have a show in a couple of suitcases and unpack the show. And it could be monumental, and yet it would still, and this is again about intimacy, which is in my work, and about the personal, and about the body, that I would have something that I carry that physically I walked in and then could be monumental. So the pinned pieces, I did one at a place called the Palais de Tokyo, which is a museum in Paris. And these other pieces were about being able, I just remember I had the big pin piece I did at the Palais de Tokyo. I had my two rolling suitcases walking through the Tuileries Gardens to the Palais de Tokyo, and I felt great. I felt like really empowered. Like, here it is. I'm going to a museum, and I have my whole show in two suitcases. So, anyway, that's part of it. This actually was the label that I made for the Palais de Tokyo. It is a color called French blue, which I recently used for another label. And it's the Desire label. Sometimes the labels have my name on them, so they are truly a brand and a signature, which was the original idea in it also. Sometimes they've lost that, as if I'm slowly disappearing as I get older. This is a label. The label's called Bruised. Again, going back to the whole domestic thing and the intimacy and the body and so forth, these are washed. You see how it bends from side, so that they're washed multiple times in various loads, except for in the center they're not washed at all. So they slowly shift color only just through laundering. So the idea was that I would wash them, and physically they would change, and that I'd have this big monumental wall, and yet it would be done in this kind of intimate way. And again, there's this whole gender issue in it, and what's male and what's female, and what's physical and what's not, and this is like redoing Richard Serra it's softening Richard Serra. This was one of the few labels. This is actually from a letter, the word bruised. So this is one of the few labels that aren't from the book. The Dallas Museum owns, thanks to Tim Hanley, actually, owns a piece that has Coward, which was the coupled label with that in it. It's not been out for years. I think it actually has stripes of bruised and coward. I think it's called Insult and Injury. In the foreground is the bruised label as a C in little boxes, and this is my show at the museum there. Again, the idea here was to get something really monumental that could be mobile. And the idea here I began to become interested. When you got a gazillion labels pinned to the wall, you lose track of them being words. They're like a murmur. You know, if you get one label and you read it, it's lost. If you have 18,000 of them in front of you, there are so many lost that you're lost. You don't get it. You don't read it the same way any longer. It becomes abstract. It becomes even more so in a piece like this where you've got 80,000 of them and they're literally muted. You have to get down and look to see that they actually say anything. So this piece. That led me to thinking about the idea of going back to some of the modernist sources I was interested in making what I refer to as sculptures of paintings. These little pieces in which I pack the labels into plexiglass boxes. Often there'll be, in the process, there'll be little bits of information, a label that you can read that sticks out. And so you can get a sense there's a word, but what you're overwhelmingly, the muffling of it is really what it's about. It's the trying to mute the voice of everything, of all those individuals. This is a recent one. It's the newest label. Often what I'll do is I'll very specifically choose Agnes Martin or a Stella or some modernist precedent that was about, in essence, removing the narrative, and by doing it, I'm punching the narrative back into it. Okay, this is to talk a little bit about I almost never show these images either, but about things that are done and put in sight. I figured it was good because we're with being at a place that has a sculpture garden. A lot of these will be outdoor pieces. I was commissioned by a collector to design a room in their house that would have, and design the stairway in that room. It's a really fabulous house. And there's an accompanying piece that's outside, which when you're walking up this circular stairway, you look out the window and you see the accompanying piece outdoors. So this was the commission that actually allowed me to purchase the studio in Houston. We had to have it because the stairways, at that point it was the biggest sculpture. It's 37 running feet. So some other commission. This goes from a piece that was probably 2000 and probably finished in 2003, and this is a brand new piece that I just saw this morning. It's not a great picture of it, that I did for a Houston collection, and it's the tallest freestanding piece I've ever made. But it's a very simple, and just to walk you through some sculptures that are placed in outdoor areas. This is a bed sheet. It's a queen size. This is me combining modernism and my interest in science, and this is to make a perfect what's referred to as a Buckminster fullerene or a buckyball out of collars, which end up, because each collar is really a different size, and had been worn differently, it falls apart, and its pattern is lost. You can't, it doesn't resolve itself perfectly because we're all screwed up human beings after all. This is when you know you have a really good gallery, when you say, I'm going to hang these things that you'll never be able to sell, and then I'm going to stick some little pieces on the floor that you'll have a hard time selling, and you're going to let me do it, which this is Tally's space. Though actually, I think this piece over here belongs to somebody in the audience here, the little piece. These are bronzes and some little fabric pieces. Again, often when I'm working on those, there needs to be something that creates. In 1987, I think I got the NEA grant, somewhere around then. One of the last years they gave NEA grants to artists, and I had never made a bronze, and I decided that I thought, oh, what the hell, let's make a bronze. I hate most sculpture that goes outdoors, and because it has no intimacy, and it doesn't deal with sort of decay and entropy very well. So let's try to make something that has a little sense of history. And everybody say, no, you can't make a bronze. And I said, well, that means for sure I need to make a bronze. Because everybody said it's much too classic of a material. You'll kill your career if you make a bronze. that's how I started making bronzes, frankly. And but often, I think in this kind of balance between permanence and entropy, which is part of this whole thing about taking apart modernism and part about, I guess it's built into my poetic sensibility. It goes back to that all nouns are verbs thing. I often will be working on pieces with great intimacy while I'm working on pieces that are very large in order to balance. It's really a sensibility thing. So these are little pieces that I sew while sitting on my lap. This is actually just a crumpled up piece. This is a handkerchief with a crumpled up list of ideas that I had in my studio, and I just crumpled it up and put the handkerchief over it, and then stiffened the handkerchief so it's always got a space for the ideas underneath it. The interesting thing about that is with the little pieces, often the titles are much more metaphoric. Like I load them down with all this poetic association, because I figure when they're that tall, in a strange way, to have a title that's that long is really, there's something about that I like too. So it's the opposite again. It's unloading the plain speak of the other ones. So like this one is Meadow Mountain Idea. I can't even really remember these titles because they're so long and metaphoric in some ways. This show I did in England at a place called the Baltic, which is a museum in Gateshead. We know about those label pieces. That's the dream label piece. This is there to introduce these other pieces, which are these word pieces. I decided, you can see them floating around there. What I decided was that I wanted some work that operated. In the label pieces, they were really about legibility and reading, not so much about voice. But I wanted some pieces that worked more like the way you overhear things in a crowd, or the way that lyrics work in a song where they're embedded in the song, or the way gossip works. It kind of moves around and swirls around you, and it changes and it alters. And so I started to, my first series of these pieces was to wake up in the night, and anything, if I remembered anything that, and you can train yourself to do this in your sleep, not that it's a good thing, but you wake up and I was trying to recall anything that had ever been written or said about me critically. So that I could actually write down all of these things, it's amazing, because I thought somewhere folded up in my mind is all of this stuff that I want to, put out there in the air so that it becomes concrete. So then I would do it in wire, and then I would rip up bed sheets and wrap them around these words. So that, and the thing is that often you couldn't read the words when they were floating, but as soon as you lit them and there was a shadow on the wall, you could absolutely read the shadow. So what you would do is you'd get enough of my, anxiety to understand my anxiety, but you would have, but you'd have to fill in the rest of it with your own anxiety, because, so if it said that I was, lousy in some way, or, and but you'd have to go, God, you'd start to put in your own demons. So this was a show that sort of dealt with that, centered around this dream piece. You can kind of see this word here where it says, if it was fully on the screen, you'd see the word speak. So you can see how you can read it. And you would often walk in and you'd not even know they were words until you saw a word projected on the wall. This actually is a whole thing that my mother said to me when she was telling, my brother's an artist, and my younger brother, and she was telling me never to speak to my brother about art. She likes what he does. And it's this whole phrase. So, and this, if you look carefully, you see it says lucky. And I won't go into what that phrase is, but anyway, so at some point then I started to deal with them as bronzes, and this is a freestanding, and I wanted to wrap them up in a couple of cases. I wanted to make them figurative again in some way. So make these sort of vessel-like, figure-like forms that were these language pieces. And this is about the same time I decided it was time to kill the book which I'd used for so many times, the John Berryman Dream Song book. And that I started to think about this issue about the slippage in meaning and the relationship to the way we reconstruct ourselves as a fiction. every time we decide, today I'm telling you some stuff and it's real, but it's also I choose what to tell you and I choose what not to tell you, and so I construct myself as a fictional version of myself for you. And then we do that every day. We get up and we construct ourselves fictionally. So we do it intentionally. We also do it the way we forget things, and then we reconstitute them. So I decided that these books that I was using, and I had a number of copies, particularly of this book, that were actually the place in which those were operating as my memory. And I no longer read the books. What I did is I read myself reading the books after I'd read the books, reading the books, like it was all these layers. So I no longer was reading them. So I decided on this one, I cut all the words out of the book and showed the words separately. Oh, this brings us to little. This is just the little side. Yes, I do these often after the sculptures. These are related to those large, flowing word pieces. I'll do drawings. So these are just two drawings. I might talk much about the drawings today, but these are two word drawings. Okay, so all of that became this kind of obsession. There's probably 4 different cut-up books, pieces, maybe 5, and I only show you the one, so I don't bore you to death today, but they're actually really critical for me, and they became something like the collars. And in fact, there was one in this show. This was at Yvon Lambert in New York. Actually, these pieces were initially shown in Dallas. This is 7 Variations of Nothing. And on one of those books, I cut all of the one of the Dream songs. I cut every word out of it except for nothing because I wanted to deal with the idea of forgetting it. And then it turned out that there were 7 versions of the word nothing in the book. And so then in this show, I showed the book with the 7 versions of the word nothing and left in it and all the other words cut out. And then these pieces, which are 7 different modernist patterns in variations with the label that says nothing. These are all 42 by 42, which is when Agnes Martin had to move from her place where she lived to her assisted living place. She worked. That was the size she worked. See, back to the whole fiction thing. I could tell you that and it could be a lie. Okay. It isn't, but it could. You know what I mean? And you go, oh, profound. This is a little side issue. This is, but it became important to me. I was my second show with the gallery in Paris opened on September 13th to September 11th year. So I just landed on September 11th, and I went directly to the gallery with my suitcases. Though I'd shipped some of the work, I had some in suitcases, and I was going to install. And we got a call and bring out the TV, and we saw the second plane hit the tower. And one of the great experiences, I couldn't call home for a few days, and I was stuck in France for a few days, and I felt acutely American, and everybody there was really great to me. And since a lot of my work deals with this question of identity, when I decided to do my next show in Paris, I decided that I would deal with it very specifically. Probably didn't decide this so much intellectually, but more emotionally, that I would deal with being an American. And so I did this one body work, and actually most of these are going to come out in a book on American imagery that's coming out this summer. But this piece is called Economy, and you recognize the shirt labels and so forth. But this is a show that I did here again with Tally. About the same time, somewhere in there's like a number of events that sort of fit into this whole acutely American phase. One of them was then some research on the flag and what every element and what the history of the flag was and what parts stand for. And the stars are for states, so that's the closest thing to states' rights or individual rights that are represented in the flags. And so I decided then that I would begin to deal with this issue of the flag in some way. I also wanted to cast some of them because the whole thing about casting something is that these are all direct casts, so that you take a flag and you burn it, in essence, to get a bronze flag. Okay, so that there was this whole possibility again of transience and about slippage of meaning and about the fact that it was about the time when everybody wanted to make it a felony to burn a flag. There was, there's all this movement towards it, and I thought that this is like, it's putting the emphasis in the wrong place. And one great thing is if you burned it, in this case, you got something that was permanent. If you left it fabric, it was ephemeral. So it was like this inversion of the whole issue. And in fact, we had to do a little research to make sure that nobody would freak out that we were burning flags, but we're burning them and they were turning into bronze. So this was the bronze ones that came out of that series. I also started to work with other components of the flag. This is the 13 stripes done as a target, a very large target. It's still got the needles hanging from it where I sewed it together. This was for my show in Paris. I made myself an outfit out of flags. Some more bronze flags. And again, in each case, there's a single star left on these ones that have them cut out, or in some cases, there's one star cut out. She got those stars after I made those striped outfits, huh? Actually, I decided when I did that show in England, I decided I would return the stars from all those flags to back into the night sky. So I made a big, going back, I made a huge piece, 10 foot by 10 foot, with hundreds of stars sewn together into a grid, so that in there you would have this thing. And again, it operated a little bit like the collar. You really couldn't see the piece, but you could see the shadow on the wall. Okay, so this is the last label piece I've done for Pinned, or the most recent one. It was up at, this is it shot in another place, though it was up in January at Tally Dunn Gallery. This is the Nothing label. This is a wall, I don't know if this is maybe 36 feet by 12 or something like that. It's that individual, it's trying to maintain a grid. It's really an Agnes Martin problem, trying to maintain a grid with individual gesture and it falling apart after a while, but having its own rhythm because of it. It was shown in this show, another little amusing story about career suicides. The fact is that I twice before this organization in Houston tried to name me Texas Artist of the Year, and both times I declined. I said, okay, I don't feel like Texas Artist of the Year. I'm too young to be Texas Artist of the Year. I don't, somehow I didn't feel like being Texas Artist of the Year. So finally, they got one of my board members from the school to come to me and say, they're afraid to ask you again. So I decided that I would be Texas Artist of the Year after my board member came to me. But I decided that what I would do is do one huge wall of nothing, and then I would do this piece, which is one of the most important early Carl Andre pieces, is called Lever. And I wanted to go back again to a modernist precedent, but there was this brick that I found that was in my yard. It's a St. Joe brick, and I thought somehow if I was going to nominate myself for sainthood if I was going to be Texas Artist of the Year. So I made a mold of this brick, and I liked other things about this. I mean, I liked the fact that I found it in the yard of the house that I bought when I moved to Houston, that in my family, when people were disgusted with me, they referred to me as St. Joe. And it was kind of a little irony. And that there would be all this other kind of historical sort of, and then the brick was very important to Houston. It's an important brick made just outside of New Orleans that a lot of the early Rice University buildings are built with. So there's that. So that piece was St. Joe's Lever. This is my last show. Unfortunately, we're going to miss the fact that these things are sitting on books. This is my last show at Tally's where the wall of labels are. I decided to go back to the fragments of clothing pieces and some of the fragments of other things like shirts and so forth that I had left over, and then rework them in a figurative way that was more classical and deal with this idea of memory and building on. And so I took books out of my own library, I made molds of them, and I made stacks of books that then would have these more figurative pieces that often, again, are referencing other sculptures, more classical sculptures. So these were leftover fragments in my studio. We're getting near the end for all of you who are wondering when. And again, being much more evidently classical in my figuration, thinking that I needed just to return and be more blatant about the figure for my own reason. And I needed to make these things, because they're on these pedestals, they become traditional immediately, and I wanted them to be more modeled the way you might model a figure rather than just existing as this draped fabric or some other way in which it doesn't show the hand. So these were manipulated. I actually worked on the waxes for like a year before we cast them. Here's a stack of the books, though, so you see what they're like. Okay, so then we're getting to the very end. This is a piece in my studio, but now it's in Paris. I just opened a show in Paris a few weeks ago. And I decided that we would go back to my collection of books, and I would begin to work directly with the books. This is cast polyurethane resin. One of the great things about this is a dictionary on top that I've had forever that has the alphabet on it, if you can kind of read it there. And so I made these molds. And in an interesting way, these pieces are made, because all of the other work is direct. If it's cast, it's direct cast, so you lose something in the process. But these are done as sort of either lost wax if they're bronzes, or in a lost wax-like manner if they're the resin pieces. So with the flashings left on and so forth. So in some ways, they're very traditional. In the way they're going on with a very untraditional results. And again, they'll often quote other things. We sort of have the Bernini twisting column here, but it's done in Sotheby's catalogs. So here it was a little pun on the replacement of value, one value for another, and because it's a very traditional bronze, I mean, it also makes a little reference to Brancusi, and since it's, as do the book pedestals that the other pieces are on. And so it was this way of like replacing, of addressing kind of different value systems in a more intimate way. So there you go. This is another book piece. The same mold with two different materials face to face. This is a book piece. This is interesting because I have a collected, in a 5-book edition of the collected writings of Freud. And these 3 books on top are the Bible, which I'd gotten from my parents when they passed away, and we divided up the books. And the Freud book, these are art history books. And actually, this is my catalog. These are 2 art history books, and that's the Freud books, and they exploded. In the process, I thought, God, the Freud, the bronze couldn't. We poured them, and the mold split apart, which never happens. And the next day, Ken King, who runs the foundry there, and it's his foundry, he was going to throw them out, and I came back really early in the morning to save them because I thought there was something probably right about the fact that Freud had exploded somewhere between the art books and the Bibles. Here's 2 dictionaries. It's sort of my Donald Judd in dictionary form. Partially, again, if you go back to the label pieces, these are mute books in a way. You have to imagine their contact. This is too bad, but we'll see another picture. This is a different piece that's a very recent piece. At the same time I was doing the shirt pieces back in high school, the other identity-related work, which I probably wouldn't have known to call back then identity-related work, was based on shoes. And so recently I've been fiddling around with these shoe pieces, which are really not yet quite out for public consumption, but they're collaging, again, the black and white shoes to cutting them up and putting them together in ways in which they seem to fit, but their juxtaposition makes clear their difference whether the difference is a class difference or casual versus dress or whatever. And then they're accumulated so much together that initially you would see them as stripes. And later on, you would begin to decode them back into the other information. And so these pieces are ongoing right at the moment, along with a lot of other things. This is my studio. One of the great things that I have now is that, and here, this is actually those book pieces as waxes. There's a book coming out of Europe on artist studios that this picture was taken for. So this is probably 3 years ago that these were up. One of the things that I have is I have space. And so I can start something, and if I can't figure out whether it's art or not, I just leave it, and I work on something else. And I might not know what it is for 4 years. I might not, something might come together really quickly, something might just sit there, and I just won't know what it is. This is an old church that was then in perfect Houston form turned into a used auto parts place that then was abandoned. That's now my studio. So that's my last picture. I will answer any question. I mean, really, anything? Yeah?
The resin
yes.
books, are they illuminated from within?
No, but there's something about the refractory nature of the resin where if you put a spotlight on them, I didn't bring, but even if the way I noticed this is I cast first the dictionary and I set it on my shelf at home. And the sun came in and hit it, and it's like the thing had a light inside of it. So there's something about that resin that works that way. That interesting thing about that resin is that it's, and I've done resin pieces since the very beginning, off and on, but some of them, as somebody here would know well, didn't work so well in the beginning. But the resin now is like UV. I mean, it can go outside. It stays. It retains its strength and it retains its color. But that does have that spectacular glow inside. That was just the one that looked like it was glowing was just a light sitting on top, was pointing down on it. Yeah?
What impelled you to start working with shoes? How did that come
Well, I mean, I think really way back in high school when I did it, I just think it was like, I mean, back then you don't really know what a conceptual artist is, and you think you kind of read a little bit about Fluxus stuff and so forth. And I was, so when I started back then, I just made them because it was something that I could make that was, and I made them out of clay initially. And I showed them, for my high school, you can imagine, that was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But for my high school, we got to do a show, and I showed shoes, white shirts, and I had a schedule in which I got a friend to sit inside of a showcase for a certain amount of hours a day. That was my show. They would come and see my friend and parts of the clothing that were around. And so that's where I started. When I came back to them now, I liked I liked the fact that they're so loaded with information, and I could go down to the resale shop and buy them. But then when I put them together, if you do show enough of them, you have to decide whether you're going to look at them for the narrative or whether you're going to look at them for the design. And so you're put in all of the work now. The verb I'm interested into turning to activating now is you. Okay? If in the beginning I was interested in how the objects activated, somewhere along the way I realized that what I was really interested in was not that the objects suggested that they were moving, but that I wanted you to have to make a decision on what your bias was, what your memory is, what your thought is. And so and you're compelled when you see the shoes to decide whether you're going to read them as shoes or how much history you're going to read into them, or are you going to read them abstractly, or are you going to... So that's what I like about them. And I also like that you naturally can show them, like, they're all, right now, the way they're done is they hang on wires, and they're like that far, they're like on point. They hang right next to the floor. So that you just get this, you still have the missing body then. You have all these wires, which are the body, and then you have the shoes on point.
I'm an elementary art teacher, and the one thing that's most difficult
Yeah, yeah. No, I was, I mean, there's a lot of ways. I mean, I was, I mean, I guess I haven't been confessional here. I was what you might refer to as an AF student. I either got an A in the class or I got an F in the class, okay? And this was any class, okay? I mean, I got an A in chemistry one semester, and then the next semester I think screw this, and I'd get an F. So I was sort of that way all the way through, and in fact, so I was sort of outside the box. I was a very, very, very shy child. I would hyperventilate when I call, you know. This really does relate to what I started with, Sherman, Texas. When I first got there to teach, I would, hi. You know, we're going to learn about art today. You know, I was so shy. I'd get really, really nervous beforehand. And so, but I was very interior. And so I guess then I was a bit of a prankster. So those things kind of fit together. And I have always been, I hope, intellectually pretty fluid. You know, I'm pretty good at a lot of different topics. I won an award in economics my freshman year while I was an art major. That sent me to the University of Chicago for one semester. They really wished it would stick. You know, no, so it was like I couldn't get into the art classes I wanted, so I took this economics class and wrote this paper and won a national award and ended up at the University of Chicago for one semester. So, I mean, that was the kind of thing, you know. I'm stable now, trust me. I'm not going to go nuts.
You explained that the first color was your own.
Yes.
But then you showed many objects. Does it matter to you whether the material belonged to the person you knew, or did it belong to anonymous people, or did material belong to, were there different items that all belonged to one person, or were there items that belonged to different persons? Does assembly of these things in your sculpture somehow bring together the anonymous and scattered former owners? In the single collars, when I first started to do them, it was very important that I knew where the collar came from. But that was only in the single collars, okay? Then I started to become much more interested in the identity. And you're right, I liked the idea. I go down to I lived at that time, because they moved the resale shop, 3 blocks from a place called Value Village, where I could buy a lot of white shirts for a couple bucks, you know. And that's what I did. I'd go in and I'd pick through the white shirts to see the ones that seemed to me to have what I would refer to at the time, and probably still would if I'm buying shoes, which is where I buy my shoes, is critical information. Okay, it has some kind of thing that seems pointed to me, and so it has poetic possibility. Even it's the funniest thing is when I'm going to pretend that I'm going to ignore something and act like it's abstract, I want it to be absolutely loaded with information. Because what I want to do is I want to be resisting that and pretend, and having chosen a point of view, knowing that the other point of view is possible. And so I'll have already decided, in a way I've had both points of view. I'll look at it and go, this is really interesting. So you're right, I could be gathering together a group of individuals in this case, and then I could be pretending that they didn't mean anything to me. So I'd have both sides of myself working at the same time. Would you remove information? I mean, some common piece of information in a white shirt is soil.
I never clean the shirts. Now, they're usually washed before, but and in fact, my first museum show was at a place which was called, it's now the Contemporary Museum in Kiev, but it was called the Soros Center at that time. And Malevich was from the Ukraine. And I did these pieces, I did these sort of white-on-white pieces that hung on the wall that were made out of white shirts, folded and sewn together on edges. And I would make the patterns depending on how soiled the shirts were. So that, you know, you could get a square in the middle of nice yellowed shirts, you know, and they would obviously, and then you could have that nice pristine white ring. But they're all bought at Value Village. I'd just go in and buy them, and then I would rearrange them to be, you know, whatever they were. So there were, yeah.
Even in the shoes, I'm really interested that they carry, some kind of information now. I wear those, will the shoe pieces actually end up being art? I'm not, they're still in that moment when I'm showing them to you now. I think they will, because people tend to, artists that have seen the images, I have them on my phone. Saw them and went, oh, those are really cool. Immediately, what are those? What are those? So there's something grabbing about them, and I just haven't gotten to the point where I've gone, you're a piece of art, fine.
The thing that occurs to me about the shoes, I don't know if it was so much because you had canvas sneakers and then leather, and you think of leather shoes as being dressed up.
Right.
But all of the different things that you can do in a pair of shoes to sort of become successful. You could not have been, in the 50s or the 60s, you could have not been allowed to use a public bathroom in black.
Right.
You could have been this wonderful dancer, or you could have been a fabulous tennis player. I mean, all kinds of things. So that's kind of what came,
And both that idea and the white-black issue. I have been in a number of shows, included in shows on whiteness and on seminars on whiteness, but often really what the shows and seminars on whiteness is recognizing that part of what defines blackness is whiteness. So I'm often in these shows that are actually that are not, or seminars that are not so much based on white identity, but issues that of using color to determine identity. So I think both the racial component and what you're describing. And then it's interesting to find things like you got a good pair of Florsheim wingtips, okay? And what goes well with that but a pair of golf shoes, because they both, and so there is these kinds of things, and really there I'm making a formal decision, but by choosing something that's loaded with information, that formal decision immediately has kind of social meaning. Do you know what I mean? Like why do so many golf shoes, are they wingtips? You end up with these things. A lot of those shoes are nurses' shoes, okay? But it's interesting because the nurses' shoes are a lot like the kinds of steel-toed black shoes that there are these connections that you put together, and you find that you're having to make these decisions based on form, but you really are actually making decisions that have other kinds of implications.
You mentioned you made a film. Have you ever thought of making a film of your Bedsheet piece versus Richard Serra's animation?
No, that'd be good. No, I haven't. The film that I made was a long time ago. It was animated, and it was about white shirts, and it was called Sanforized. But I made that when I was in high school. But that would be interesting. I'd probably, though the better would be, they're very famous Richard Serra piece of throwing lead. It should be like me throwing water or something. It'd be something that can't hold its form.
Collaborate with Serra and get him to throw the lead and you throw the water.
Yeah, I have two Richard Serra stories. They're my two personal experiences with Richard Serra. One is that one of those shirt pieces was at a really good collector's house, and he was there because he was going to do a commission for them. And he's a notoriously difficult person, yeah. And he went around, and he was most of the art they had were by people who he'd consider his peers, and he just was trashing them. He's terrible, da-da-da. He came to my piece, and he said, support that guy. That guy's really good. He didn't know I was there. But it was because he didn't. It was because I was absolutely no threat to him. He had no idea who I was. So there was that. And the other thing is, and then I met him, and I still don't think he knew exactly who I was. He knew who I was, but I don't think he connected the two things. And then... he agreed to come lecture at the school, and we arranged the lecture and so forth. And about 2 weeks out, his lawyer called me and said, "Richard does not sing for his supper." And I thought, okay, that's all right. That meant Richard wasn't going to come and lecture. So he's not. I think he thought that because the museum was going to try to do a commission with him, and I think that these two things were separate events. I'd asked him to lecture. I think he thought that he was being forced to lecture in order to get the commission. And so I want to give him real credit here. He just was connecting the two events, and they were unconnected events in my mind. And so that's why he said that. He just didn't want to come and have to explain his work publicly before the museum commissioned it. So it really was it was an act of integrity. It just, he just has a way of being very direct. Any other questions? Yeah?
I'm trying to picture where the drapes are in the museum. Is it the museum that faces this in it, or the one you go underground?
Yeah, you know, if you go underground and into it, you're going through the spectacular James Turrell tunnel. That's the spectacle. I'm the anti-spectacle. I'm the work, if you go in the main doors up above, and that really is, I mean, a lot of my work is the antithesis of spectacular. It comes over to you and it taps you on the shoulder and says, you know, do you want to talk? Whereas some other works are about, and that really is not a decision, that's a sensibility thing. That's just how I have always been. It's in the things I like, music and so forth. So mine are upstairs, they're by the door, but they're an artist friend of mine refers to them as stealth art. You can go by them and not even know that they're art, okay? But that's how I would want them. I mean, I don't find that offensive in my case. I find that they are so supposed to be there, and they were intentionally, because that building there are many wonderful things about that building, but one of the things that when I was asked about doing the commission that I was responding to also was these huge letters that say M-F-A-H, and I thought, oh God. What are you going to do with that? I wanted something where you just kind of go through and go, what are those? Or did somebody leave, drapery? Now, if you go and see them, go across the street, if you imagine them together, they're made so that compositionally, they both visually will make one composition together, so they're absolutely bonded, and they each work as a composition separately. The whole idea there was the idea that you would visually draw them together, so that the idea that they would open, and close in your mind. And that's probably something that almost no one gets, but now I've given you the clue. Go, step across the street, and it, because it'll do that. They were made next to each other. As I said, that's a piece about this big. I made a couple of different versions of that, smaller ones at first to get it down right. And the whole idea was that there would be, I would take this thing that represented order, the white collar that represented a certain kind of order, and I would take this other kind of order, which is very common both in biology and also at the time, Rice University had developed a superconducting particle, silicon particle, called a Buckminster-Fullerene, referring to the Buckminster-Fuller pattern. So what I would do is that pattern is used a lot of time. It shows up a lot in nature because of and in fact, it's a pattern for a number of viruses because it's such a perfect pattern. What I wanted to do was start out with this idea that I would make a perfect sphere with that pattern, but I'd be using all these individuals, i.e. collars, all of these individual identities to make it, and I would just make it by hand, and I put it together, and then we'd cast it in bronze. The fact is what I ran into is that because between my imperfections and the fact that all of those individuals are different, so the unit that I'm using is a different unit each time, it's impossible to maintain the pattern. So what I do is I ended up closing it off on the other end with in an awkward place where I couldn't maintain the pattern any longer. So in some ways, it's about the breakdown of order. Do you know what I mean? It's like every intention about being perfect and idealized. Every intention of having something become so ideal that it becomes other, and yet it can't. It breaks down and becomes incident. It becomes you. It becomes a biography. It becomes an autobiography. It's a fiction. just like anything else. It can't remove itself from you. I'm actually, at the time I finished that one, I decided I would give it one more shot. And but I didn't, bronzes cost some money to make, and I didn't at the time have the money to make it, so I'm actually right at the moment, I've gone back to that piece, and I'm making a new sphere with the idea that there might be if I have a little bit more forethought, I might be able to resolve it with a little bit greater perfection. I still think I'll probably fail, but I think that failure is now, I've always wanted to do it, so I'm working on it now. Sometime this summer I'll finish the ball of collars, and then we'll cast them as it comes up. Probably a year from now I'll have one more of those, or maybe 6 months from now. Be about that big. Yeah, it would be impossible structurally, and I like here, in this case, I like the tensility, the strength of the bronze. This is the other thing, how to decide when something's going to be a bronze and something's going to be another material. I always think that this is, again, one of my pat sayings, but you have to, in a bronze, in my bronzes, you have to feel the calories, the heat, all the effort. And so often when you feel one of my bronzes, it'll feel like it goes up. And when you feel one of my fabric pieces, it'll feel like it goes down, that it gives in to entropy in a different way. So all those calories, all that energy that was put into it has to somehow translate. It's not 100% the case, but that's 99% of the time they have this other kind of energy. They're 90% copper. I mean, that's what bronze is. So they have that too, that difference. And I think if you did those in the polyurethane, you wouldn't have that. You just would have something else. All right.